Hello and welcome to this Let's Chat roller coaster. My name is Karen Emmons and I am a VASA board member, one of the technology event group leaders, and a national event supervisor. I'm accompanied today by Brandon Harvey. Give me a second to spotlight the two of us here. All right. Mr. Harvey is a physics teacher at Oakton High School. He's been an event supervisor for many building events over the years for VASO and will be part of our tournament appeals committee this year. The last time roller coaster was in the rotation, he was the event supervisor for it for 2 years. So he has lots of experience in seeing what happens in this event and where people go wrong. I should also tell you that Brandon is the husband of our state director, Emily Owens, and they own a gargantuan but adorable dog named Eddie Van Halen, who sometimes likes to be on camera. So we'll see if Eddie joins us this morning.
We might see it when I tend to get rambling and talking a lot. He sees that as a sign that he needs to make an appearance to get things back on track.
In our time this morning, we cannot possibly cover every rule or situation in the rules or VASA clarifications. Nothing we say here today supersedes a rule or clarification. You still will need to read the rules. Read the rules often, because every time you do, you'll see something else and then read them again. And don't forget about the VASO clarifications on the website, which are as binding as rules. I know that we have a lot of parents here today. Please remember that Science Olympiad is a hands-on activity for students and a hands-off activity for parents. Students must build all parts of the devices that they bring to the tournament. But parents can and should teach tool skill and safety. They can help students think about what should go in a practice log and the design log. And please help them package it up for traveling to tournaments. Those roller coasters can be very sensitive. As we get going, I encourage you to put your questions in the chat, and I'll keep an eye on them to make sure that they get asked. Welcome, Brandon, and thank you for your time this morning.
No problem. Looking forward to it.
Roller coaster, what is the task?
All right. So, long and short of it is we are constructing a roller coaster for a ball or sphere. There are many different types that you can use. They have different characteristics. Generally speaking, the roller coaster has to be designed so that the ball will travel from a start line to a finish line in as close to the given target time as possible. One thing about that target time is that in order to keep the competitors on their toes and give them some work to do during the competition time, that's not announced until after the impound occurs. And so the competitors are then only given competition time during which to make those modifications.
Great, thank you. So let's start with, I always think it's very useful as you're thinking about building something to know how it's scored. You know, what are we judging it on? So could you go about the elements of the score, talk about the elements of the scoring?
Absolutely. There's basically 4 main elements for scoring. The first is the height of the device, because as you think about it, the higher you can get, the more you can get gravity to work on the ball for you. And that's the only force you can use to provide acceleration. So there's some give and take there. The height of the device is technically modifiable. So because of that, that's going to be measured at the end of every completed run.
So you're saying that the height, do they get a better height score if they start at a lower height or at a higher height?
They would get a better score by having a lower device, but that's the trade-off, is you're getting more points for having a shorter device, but then you're not having as much of gravity helping you out. Let's see. So the next one is the time score. Every second up to the target time is going to be worth 5 points to you. Every second past the target time that your device runs will be negative 5 points. During competition, the device target time can be anywhere from 30 to 60 seconds. During regionals, that can be anywhere in 5-second intervals, 2 seconds for states. So we do the math, you get 5 points per second. If you actually hit the target time, that can range from 150 to 300 points. But given that you don't know how long the target time is going to be, that's also going to be the most variable coming into the tournament. It's also, I would say, just as an aside, probably the most common one for teams to maximize and to get the most out of. So most of your time is very likely going to be spent trying to optimize the other 3 categories.
All right, so let's go back. We have a question about the height. People are asking, how is the height of the device measured? From what to what?
It is, first, it's measured in centimeters, and it is measured from the bottom of the base perpendicularly up to the topmost point of the device.
Actually, I'm going to clarify that a little bit. I know what you mean by what you said, but it's actually, when you say the bottom of the base, you're not talking about, you know, if you think about like where you have a sheet of plywood as the bottom of the base, it's not the top of the plywood. It's measured from the top of the table you've set the roller coaster on, or the
Thank you
floor.
for saying that.
Right. So
yes, absolutely.
So the thickness of the base is also part of the height, and it's just measured to the maximum. It's measured to the maximum spot of height spot of the roller coaster, right?
Yes, indeed, indeed.
Without the ball.
Right, correct. Because the ball itself is not part of the coaster. That is more or less referred to sometimes as even the vehicle, I believe, in the rules.
Okay, so yeah, so from the tabletop to the highest point of the roller coaster. Great. Does anybody have it? So that was the question that came through on the height score. Anybody have a question on the time score? One of the things that I think you've said to me as we've talked about roller coasters is that the hardest thing about the time is actually making it go long enough, right?
Yeah, very, very much so. I mean, often when you're starting out building these devices, you're going to come up with multiple devices that are going to run, and they're going to go from the beginning to the end, no problem. You can get very consistent with that. The trick, or part of the difficulty in this event, comes from, one, getting enough speed to be able to do these other elements that we haven't gotten to yet, while two, still having enough space within the coaster to be able to extend the time that it's technically running. So that's actually a really unique element. And there are a lot of different ways that some teams use to modify their coasters. Some use different turns that can be occurring. Some just take parts out and replace them.
All right, and we'll talk a little bit more about construction in a moment. We're still trying to actually highlight. Okay, actually, I'm sorry. We have one other question. If there's a frame, but the start line is lower, does that mean is the height is measured to the top of the frame? It is measured to the tallest point in the roller coaster. It doesn't matter whether your start line is lower. It is measured to the thing that is the tallest.
So even technically, if the start line is on a piece of track, which is the highest portion of the roller coaster, the highest point of that track, even if it's beyond the start line, is what we measure to.
Okay. All right. So we've talked about the height score. We've talked about the time score. What are some of the other scoring elements? And I know that these ones are optional.
Yes. Optional, but highly suggested for competitive scoring. Let's see. First would be the gap score. This is something that has been used in prior years as well. The idea of these gaps is that the ball needs to travel completely unsuspended through the air from one what's the term for it? Let me get, what is the term? I have it right here.
Well, essentially it's the takeoff spot, right?
Right, right. Yeah, I don't want to keep us just sitting here staring at my face. So yes, the edge of the track. We will measure the horizontal distance from one end to the other, and we will measure the closest points of those. That gets to the heart of what I was talking about as far as speed was concerned. More speed means you're going to be able to have a larger gap. It also can mean that it's going to be a little bit less stable, potentially harder to control. So in terms of maximizing points, there's some give and take of what we need to be calibrating there. As far as scoring the actual gaps, you can have 2 scoreable gaps. You get 4 points for every whole centimeter of that gap, again, measured horizontally. And then there are some finer points for construction of those gaps that we'll get into later on.
You don't get any points for the gap, though, unless there's a certain minimum distance, right? So what is that minimum distance?
That minimum distance is 5 centimeters. And again, it's measured by whole centimeters. So 4.7 is not sufficient.
All right, so if you have a gap that's 3 centimeters, even if you successfully make that gap, you get no score for it because the minimum thing to be called a gap is 5 centimeters, just reiterating that. All right, when we'll talk. Okay, so a gap is a possible element, but not optional. And then what's the other optional element?
The other optional element is new this year. It is the loop. The loop gives you 6 points for each whole centimeter of its height. Now, there are very specific requirements for how we're going to measure that height as well. But I think you'll find that it's going to have a lot of the same sorts of trade-offs that we're dealing with the gap. You're going to need to have a certain amount of speed in order to be able to successfully traverse these loops, which potentially is at the cost of the stability of the device. I'm sure it is absolutely capable of being done, but with it being the new element, I'm interested to see what you all come up with.
Indeed. So is there a minimum height that the loop has to be scoreable? Could a small loop be scoreable as well?
That is what I'm looking at as well. The height, correct me if I'm wrong, but I do not see that there is a minimum for the loop.
I think that's my understanding as well.
I would say that just like every other form of measurement, we round down to the nearest whole. So you need to keep that in mind as far as what height you do achieve. Because it is actually worth more points than the gaps on a per centimeter basis. But again, just whole centimeters. We don't do percentages.
All right, and we'll talk a little bit more, I think, about the gap and the loop, some other facets of those things later as we talk about the construction. Now, there are tiers in this event. So can you explain what that means and what the tiers are?
There are definitely. There are 3 tiers. Tier 1 is going to be everything followed the rules correctly during the competition and during the construction. Tier 2 is reserved for situations where there are violations either of construction or of the competition itself. And then finally, tier 3 is if there is any coaster elements and any ball or sphere that has not been impounded that is used during the competition. That even includes things like the tools you want to use. So that is honestly one of the easiest ways to inadvertently ruin your competition, is to forget to bring your tools and leave them with the device. The one exception to that is goggles. You're allowed to bring goggles with you.
So tiers, just for people who are not familiar with it, tier 1 is the place where you want to be, because everything in tier 2, no matter how good it looks, scores behind tier 1. So let's say you make a roller coaster that's too big. That would be a construction violation. And we'll talk about the dimensions in a minute. But if you have a construction violation, it'll put you in tier 2. And even if you hit the target time and you've got gorgeous big gaps and you do the loop, it doesn't matter. You will still score behind a roller coaster that is nowhere close to the time, but is in tier 1. So it's really important to pay attention to the construction parameters, to all the rules and regulations to be in tier 1. And I'm going to reiterate what Brandon says about tier 3. That whole impound thing, that's a heavy penalty. If you don't impound, if you don't come to impound, if you don't impound the ball, if you don't impound the coaster, if you don't impound your spare parts or your tools, it all has to be impounded. Because tier 3 obviously is behind everybody in tier 2, so it puts you way down at the bottom. All right. So let's talk about the dimensions of the vehicle, or excuse me, the vehicle of the roll. I've been doing a lot of these, and so sometimes my language gets confused. Let's talk about the dimensions of the roller coaster track.
Yes, absolutely. The device itself is going to be 60 centimeters by 60 centimeters by 30 centimeters. And
actually, that's the max, right? It doesn't
correct.
have to be. Okay.
Correct. Up to those amounts, which again, there are points to be had by dealing with those limitations. Now, it is also worth mentioning that one of the 60s is the height. So it's not limited to 30 centimeters as far as height is concerned.
Right. So you could go narrower and have more height, the 60 centimeters of height.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But again, there's that trade-off you talked about, right? Because the taller, you get less height.
The taller it is, the more speed you're going to be able to pick up, the more space you're going to be able to have to work with as far as creating twists and turns to extend the run length. There's a lot you can play with in this event, which is one of the reasons why I think the competitors find it so interesting.
Yeah, right. And this is at all times. So the dimensions, when they come in and during their setup time, and they maybe if they're swapping out parts of the track or something like that to meet the target time, it still always has to be within these parameters. Correct?
Yes, absolutely. Like one of the most unfortunate things that I saw in past years was competitors that had measured everything down to the closest millimeter, but then forgot that one of the elements required a nut or bolt that itself then measured beyond. And there's an exactness to this that you need to be cognizant of everything you are putting on the device. Because that's the worst sort of construction violation to get when you have a perfectly good and working device, but some modification you make in the middle of the competition has an inadvertent effect on the measurements of the device.
Fasteners are a big problem, right? People like build a frame and don't build the frame to 60 by 60 by 30. Wood warps, it expands. Build it slightly less so that there's no question for our event supervisor. Right. But then they fasten things to it that have big fasteners that stick out. And the device is measured at its max, at its max, at its max, right? So that includes any fasteners you have on the outside of a frame you might have built.
Absolutely. Just a blanket statement that I've told competitors every year when they're right up against those edges. I've never seen a device that's 59, 59, 29 and wasn't as competitive as one that's 59.9, 59.9, 29.9. And you just have so much more freedom to be able to fix broken elements, because things can happen. You might have to modify your device during the competition day, but by the competition, that's not going to be a huge problem for you. You're going to be so used to working with it that you'll be able to get in there and fix it within a couple minutes. But the worst thing that could happen is you built it exactly to specifications, and then you now have no room to play with. So that's definitely something I would keep in mind when you're designing the device.
Our pro tip for the day. All right. So now we have a hugely important clarification on our VASO roller coaster event page. I know Brandon's going to share his screen and talk to you about this. This is a very, very important clarification.
There we go. So hopefully you can see this now. The main clarification we want to talk about is this one from November 4th. I'll read it off in its entirety. It says the entire track must not be fully enclosed, and the ball should be easily removable for the entire coaster, not just the loop, as mentioned in 3K2, the rule 3K2. For the ball to be considered easily removable, the device or track must not have to be manipulated by the event supervisor to get the ball out. That means we need to be able to reach in at any point along the track and be able to pull the ball out without affecting the device at all. That's real. I was just going to say that's so important for us to emphasize that, because within these rules, it looks like that rule is only referring to the loop, but it absolutely refers to the entire device.
We actually checked this with Nationals, and this is Nationals' understanding as well. So we are in line. This is actually not a more rigid understanding here in Virginia. Nationals wrote back to us, and because we were checking to make sure to see if that easily removable and visible at all times and easily removable was only for the loop. And they said that their intention was for the entire roller coaster. So that means you can't have a clear plastic tube.
Correct.
Even though it's visible, it's not easily removable.
Right.
And what
you can't even have a track that's partially enclosed that we just deform to be able to pull the ball out, because that is modifying the device.
Right. So you don't want to have to stretch the sides of the walls or have to perform strange surgical procedures to get the ball out. And that has to be true at every point in the roller coaster.
Correct.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions on that? Because it's so important. Please keep reading that. All right. So, so there are a few other important construction issues. You want to go through those?
Absolutely. I actually saw a question about something I'm about to mention. The only reason we didn't say it right then was because we were going to be getting to it right here. Only gravitational potential energy. No springs, no rubber bands, no magnets. All you can use to create force is gravity. Another element, which is actually going to be tied to some of these modifications we're talking about, only one start and finish line in the entire device. They cannot move relative to one another during the competition.
Now that's that has a lot of impact, right?
Absolutely. Like one of the ways I saw teams try to modify their device is just have a completely removable final section, including the finish line. But each of those sections, if it has its own finish line, is moving that finish line and is not allowed. So the way you design your device, you're going to have a start somewhere up here. you're going to have a finish somewhere down here. You can move around things in between, but neither of those can move during the competition.
And very important, because I think, the natural inclination would be, oh, well, we have a shorter time, we'll move the start line down here. We'll just start lower down, or we'll start higher up, and that's absolutely disallowed.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
We have another question about the easily removable. It says, if the tracks are very close together, it may not be easy to put your hand in. Does this imply the tracks have a minimum separation, or is this really about deforming the track at the spot where you want to take the ball out? I'm going to say we're not jerks.
Right. Yes, I agree with that. Absolutely. We certainly try not to be anyway. So if it's something that like I could reach in and pull it out and it doesn't really meet those limitations like we'd already mentioned, my guess is you'll be fine. I would try to avoid that in your design if possible. At least try to avoid it being a repeat issue left and right, but I would think you would be fine.
Well, you know what? We can't really pre-approve this without seeing it, right? Because I can envision, let's say you have a bit of track here, and then you have a track immediately underneath it, essentially that's open, but is really, I mean, only the slightest, I'm not being able to show this very well with my hands, but you can imagine stacking the track so that the top track really is a ceiling for the bottom track. Right. That to me says that that's not easily removable. You'd have to deform the upper track to get to the ball, no matter how tiny your hand was. Sure. But if it's just a matter because the ES has kind of a big hand and has to,
Right. I would, one way that this may be something that we need to talk about outside, but one thing I'm thinking is that there should at least be a difference, a gap between the track, the size of the ball. And I mean a gap between the topmost portion of the lower track and the bottommost portion of the upper track. And that's so like including walls and things like that. I think that would at least help. But even then, I would argue that you should do more than that.
But that seems clear. So, and we're having a question from Kira saying, would then the minimum separation be the diameter of the ball? And that certainly seems very logical, because otherwise you're deforming track no matter what to get it out.
Exactly.
So that seems a reasonable statement, Kira, I think.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
Okay, so good, thank you. That was a good discussion point. Okay, we've dealt with the magnets. Only one start, one finish line. I think that those are the main construction parameters. Let's talk about the gaps.
Certainly. Alrighty. So the first of our optional components. Again, to reiterate, the gaps must be minimum of 5.0 centimeters. We will not round 4.95. 5.0 between the starting track and the ending track of the gap. And again, we will measure the smallest distance of it. So if you have it for some reason cut at an angle, we will look through and find the smallest amount, just because that's the fairest way to be equal with everybody.
So if you have like a little bit of a ramp, let's say it's the measurement from here. It's not the measurement from here to here. It's the measurement from a line extended down to here, to where it lands.
Exactly. It is only a horizontal measurement.
And this also is about just the track, right? It has nothing to do with, let's say the ball takes off and it lands here. You're not measuring where the ball landed. You're measuring the potential gap, right?
Correct. We are measuring exactly as you say. Where the ball lands has nothing to do with it. We are measuring edge to edge.
Okay. What about,
I saw a quick question that said 3 optional. The 3 option, you can have 2 gaps and 1 loop.
okay, so that's why 3 optional. Thank you.
Yes.
All right. So look, what other things do we need to know about the construction of the gap?
Let's see. No bouncing or anything of the like to extend gap distance. The ball needs to be falling through the air while traversing the gap. Another thing which is going to be a common element between the gaps and the loop is these need to be clearly labeled. Past devices I've seen have the gap with like gap labeled gap number 1, like an actual board behind the track with lines delineating, arrows pointing to the edges of these gaps. And some people even try to take it upon themselves to show the measurement themselves. We appreciate that, but we will be measuring it by ourselves. But anything you can do to call out the gap and to distinguish the 1 start and the 1 finish is what we'd be looking for.
Okay. What else about the gap?
Let's see. So nothing underneath to catch it. We must have at least 0.5 centimeter above any track beneath it. You cannot bounce on lower track and then land up on the end edge and have that count. Let's see. Gap cannot end with the ball hitting a wall. There's a requirement for unbroken track. What we have taken that as a straight path of at least 5 centimeters at the end of a gap before any walls, before any turns. So also something to keep in mind as you're building your device, like if your gap is getting close to the edge of your maximum size, you need to make sure you at least have the 5 centimeters worth of track and space for the turn.
Okay, so the gap. So let's look at this unbroken track. So the ball lands on the other end, and there has to be 5 centimeters that it travels in that same direction without going into going down to the next level, turning, or anything else. So somebody has asked about ending a gap with a funnel. Is that a possibility? Is that a doable thing? I mean, it sounds tricky to me based on what you've said about the gaps.
Right. My concern with that would be where your 5 centimeters of unbroken track is. You can have it go then into a funnel after that, but we would definitely be looking for those 5 centimeters.
So yeah, because funnels, if it goes into a funnel, I mean, there's a lot of problems here. If you put the funnel this way, it's probably hitting a wall, which is not allowed. If you put the funnel this way, it's going to come in and go, which is not straight, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard to imagine that ending a gap with a funnel is really. There's probably a way you could do it, but it may not.
Right.
But it's hard for us to envision a straightforward way.
Right, correct. And I would say the guiding determination should be funnels are potentially possible to use. You need the 5 centimeters of unbroken track for it to land on.
Okay. The other thing to think about funnels is that the ball has to be, removable at all places on the track.
Yep.
Remember too, right? Visible and removable.
Mm-hmm.
All right. I do see a few so the 5 centimeters of unbroken track must be straight. Yes. So this is how we're understanding it. Can the point where the ball lands be a broader triangular tray that suddenly becomes an unbroken straight track?
That is not itself a straight track. It must land on the 5 centimeters of unbroken track. So I would say no.
Are you sure? I mean, I'm going to question that one. Maybe there's if it's still going straight, or are you thinking it's going to kind of wobble in this little tray?
The
I guess
main
it kind of
issue I
depends
would,
on.
sure, and that's why I don't want to allow something where I would then have to retract it later. There are situations that I could envision that being okay. There are also some where I don't think so. One of those being if it's, I'm trying to think how I would even show this, is if we're dealing more with a right triangle, is that even, that's not. If we're dealing more with a right triangle where it lands at the bottom of the base, and then the track continues at the end of the opposite vertex, I would say that that's problematic because we're running into a wall in order to get to the straight track. So I would call that a context specific question that we would need to see.
And I think that's really, that's the important thing here is, what it's going to be being judged on. Does it have the 5 centimeters of unbroken straight track? And does it have, and is it being considered to hit a wall? And what we're going to be looking at, and don't tempt us to judge it the wrong way. All right, before we discuss loops, we've had a couple questions going back to the ball. Does the diameter or the weight of the ball matter?
No.
Okay.
There are a lot of different things you could use. I've seen racket balls, I've seen ping pong balls, I've seen ball bearings. They all have different characteristics. They're all good for some things and potentially bad with other things. So that's part of the exploration of this event.
Can the ball be like a little matchbox car with wheels?
No, it is specifically listed as a ball or a sphere.
Okay.
Now, all that said, I would probably suggest not a soccer ball just because, of the limitations of what we're dealing with, but
When my daughter did this event many years ago, she used a ball out of a mouse when they still had those. They're really, and if they make those are actually great balls. Here's another little tip, just because they're designed to roll smoothly, but it's very hard to find like an old mouse that's like that, but it was a great ball.
If you have one,
right.
take it apart and play with that.
Yeah, it was a good one. All right, so we've discussed the gap. Let's talk about the elements of the loop.
All right, so new element from past years, the loop, let's see. To start, the beginning and the ending of the loop must be at the same height. We call this the point of intersection. And what it means is that you have to label that. And let me actually get into the finer points of the labeling, and hopefully that will elucidate what is meant by this point of intersection. The loop is scored by the measurement of that point of intersection up to the highest point of track on the loop. So like the jump or the gaps, we are only, in this case, measuring a perfect vertical line. If we have to use a right angle to get over to the actual top portion, that's something that we will take care of. But the specific thing to consider is that that point of intersection means there is one point along which the entry track and the exit track will meet up, horizontally speaking, and that needs to be clearly labeled, as well as the topmost point of the loop for us to measure. Let's see. Trying to think of other specifics, as this is
So
a new
I've drawn
element.
a silly little diagram here, but here's a loop, and then this is this bottom point of intersection, right?
Perfect.
That when you look at, they may not, so that when they look at it from the side, it looks like they are, one point. Obviously, they're not going to be 1 point, but when you look at
Right.
it from the side, it looks like this. That's that bottom point of intersection they're talking about, then measured up to the top.
Right.
So
Yes.
yeah, sorry, my little sticky note diagram, but I thought that might be helpful. Does anybody have any questions? What else do we need to know about the loop?
Well, like every other portion of the track, and again, this is where they put the discussion of not fully enclosed, but the loop as well needs to be not fully enclosed. The ball must have enough speed that it doesn't actually separate from the track. That is going to be a specific element that I would imagine we'll see some difficulty with in the early tournaments. And the way around that, I would say, is to just make a smaller loop. Now, that's part of what we're talking about with what you have to play with in some of these elements. More speed means you'll be able to do a larger loop, but more speed also means your ball has a greater chance of becoming a little bit unruly. It's certainly something that you can design for and correct, but it could take some time. But that is certainly all about what this event is for: getting through and maximizing our points.
My wonderful little diagram here. So what I think I hear you saying is that if let's say my ball enters into the loop and then it comes up here and then it loses oomph and it falls and it still lands and then continues on its way, that will
Correct.
not be considered, that won't be scored as a completed loop, correct? It's got to really go really around the loop. So this
Right.
falling out of the loop and continuing on is not a scoreable action.
It could look like it hits 75% of the track, but if it detaches at all, we're not supposed to score that, and we won't score it.
If I were going to try a loop, I think I'd try it early on in my ball still had a lot of energy, because won't it at least pick up
absolutely.
some of it comes around? So, but that's just my own thought here.
Absolutely.
All right, I'm not seeing any questions about loops. So let's. So again, I think you've already talked some about this, but let's continue seeing, how do we work out this timing? Because the timing is a tricky thing, and you can't move the start and the finish lines.
Sure.
Right.
So it can be, for the regional, it can be anywhere from 30 to 60 at 5-second intervals. So 30, 35, 40, so on. I've seen in the past, there are places where competitors added in a wall which sends it off in a different direction, and that track may take more or less time to get through. I have seen competitors with complete sections of track that are removable and replaceable with more or less walls within that section to take more or less time. And a lot of these more competitive devices could absolutely account for any of those time frames within those within 30 to 60 seconds. It does get more specific once you get to states. Again, that goes down to 2 seconds, so that would be 30, 32, 34, so on. But those are the two most common ways I've seen, because you can just have it right in the middle of your device and have that be a relatively easily removable section that you can just slide out of the side.
All right. So I remember I've seen people, and maybe this is what you described. I've seen people have like almost like a little table section that they could swap in and out that has just different, like the way that the tracks could be adjusted, like a
little Plinko machine.
Plinko machine almost, except it didn't vary about where it ended up. I think a Plinko machine that can go a lot of different ways, but that kind of thing where you could swap it out or shift or move a piece of the track on and off of that, and that's a common or a good A good
they might
place to
have
have some change.
they might have the base of that track done with styrofoam or the like, so because I've seen walls that are just pieces of paper with toothpicks on either side, and you can just stick it right into the surface and create a new wall to send it off in a different direction. There are lots of different ways that you can get into that, and very interesting, I think.
Indeed, they are. So we've had a question going back to loops. If you could take a quick look at your section of the loops and the rules. Is there any minimum track distance required after the loop for the ball to travel, like there is with a gap? And again, you can look at, as I said, this talk is a lot about building and the highlights. So you also can, AK, you can read your rules as well and look to see. And if it doesn't say there is, then there isn't.
I do not see one.
Okay. All right, great. So let's move on. This is a big, the next issue we're going to address is about kits. And we have a clarification about kits. Please listen carefully. This is a very important topic in this event. So Brandy, could you share the clarifications again?
Yes,
and then we'll talk about
absolutely.
kits.
There we go. So we'd be talking about this second one right here, which states in full, as an addition to Rule 4B4, if a kit was used to build a team's device, the design log must also include an explanation of at least one substantial modification made to the kit as required by the constructed devices policy. Now, what is a substantial modification? That is one of the more important questions we've dealt with in this event. We would tell you that would be a functional change to the coaster that has a reasoning behind where you would say it makes the kit better. Why did you change the device, and how did you improve the device by doing that? The reason behind that is because there are devices out there which are more or less sold as this is a way to beat this event, and the goal of these events is exploration and experimentation, and we want to see that in the competitors, and so that's where this substantial modification language comes from.
Great. So a cosmetic change is not a substantial modification.
Absolutely.
Swapping out one part for an essentially equivalent part, like if you buy a kit, build it exactly as it said, and we do know what the kits are, and just maybe swap out the ball. That's not a substantial modification either.
I saw that a team had swapped out just the means by which they attached some of the elements together, but the elements still function the same way. So that did not count as a substantial modification either. Okay.
All right. So that's an important part, and the students need to put information about that in their design log. It will be looked at. They will be asking questions, ask questions about it. If you build a roller coaster out of paper, and a lot of these kits do that, but use sections from a kit, would that count as a substantial modification? Like if you build part of it from the kit and then parts of it on your own without using kit materials?
Well, a lot of these kits provide templates for creations of turns or straight tracks or what have you, even templates for how you would make a ramp for a gap. Using those templates is not problematic. We've seen tons of devices that are largely made out of paper, and they use those templates to great effect. where you would run afoul of the rules is if your device largely conforms to the shape and function of the device as advertised. So using the templates in and of themselves is not a violation.
Thank you. And I'm going to put a plug in here is that students need to have put the design log together by themselves. This is a great spot for parents to help suggest and help work with kids on this, to help them figure out what goes in that. But since they're going to be asked questions about their design log, it shows very much if they don't know what's in it, right? They need to put it together themselves. And by putting this information in the design log, we're actually trying to help the students have words, right? And be able to talk about it a little bit more readily. Does building a kit in full and then adding another section after the end of the kit count as a substantial modification? These are sort of, it depends, right? You know, some things can't be judged until you see them.
Right.
It depends on what you're doing with that extension. If you just add another little piece of track, probably not. So this is one of the reasons why we always say in Science Olympia, we can't prejudge your device because we don't know, you know, you have an image in mind when you describe it, and we might have another image in mind when we say yes, no. So this is why we tell you the rules, how we're going to be judging, what we're looking at, and functional modification. There has to be a reason why you've done that and what it does.
Exactly.
We've been asked the question, can you edit your design log during impound? No. After you've impounded everything, you don't get any access to any of it. Now, if you're standing in line to impound your coaster, sure, you can be writing like a mad person.
We would hope you're not doing that at that point.
but after something's been impounded, you have no access to it until it's time to compete with it. That's what impound is about. All right. So I think we've had another question. Can we use slops or humps to increase or decrease speed?
Use what?
I don't know what a slop is. AK, can you define a slop? But
yeah. Slopes.
Slopes. Oh. Sorry.
Absolutely. I would say that is a significant element of the entire design is modifying it to add speed where you need and to take it away where you don't. So absolutely.
Somebody has asked about wheels again. I think that you mean wheels on the vehicle. We've answered this question before, but go ahead and answer it again.
Nope. The rules specify a ball or a sphere used as your vehicle. So there should be no wheels of any kind
on the ball. And I'm assuming that that's what the person asking the question is asking about. All right. So any particular suggested constructed materials for this?
I've seen really competitive devices that are just made out of household materials. We've seen plenty of devices, like was mentioned before, that use those templates from kits and still is clearly of the competitor's own mind. So those, again, are not themselves a violation. I've seen great devices that used cardboard, cereal boxes, different types of tubing, usually like half of the tube or something. So we've got the open air element to it. Your device very likely will start pretty simple, and then you'll start to add these elements as you get more comfortable with how your balls or spheres are going to move, or how the status of the track, what it's made of, affects how it moves. So there's really, we've seen tracks that are mostly 3D printed. The only limitations are what you can come up with as far as it's still fitting within the rules. So I would just start with materials you have around the house at this point, and then go from there. It'll probably get more elaborate as you go.
Thank you. All right, we're getting a little more clarity on the wheels question. The person is actually asking if you can use wheels as track elements. So like, could you have a wheel? I guess the ball would roll into a cup, and then the wheel would turn and the ball would fall out of the cup and move track somewhere else, or wheels that just no energy can be provided except gravitational energy.
Right. So that would be my potential concern with that. There are some instances that I'd be curious to see, but that is the guiding rule that we would use as far as any sort of wheel within the device, whether it actually imparts any energy that it should not be doing.
Okay. But in and of itself, so again, look at the rules, think carefully. Am I meeting this rule about only gravitational energy? Is it imparting energy? But I think that the track doesn't have to be, I'm going to go for a generalization, kind of leaving the wheels thing to the side. The track does not have to be the same material for the entire track, correct?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, that goes with what I mentioned about the styrofoam portion of the trap, where you could just insert pieces to make it take longer or shorter. There's a lot of variation with what we can do here.
I am very leery of this wheel. I think that it would be very hard to do in a legal way, but it would be interesting to see.
I have a couple that I'm thinking of that I might try, but not even enough that I would want to even suggest them to people. I would equally be leery of this.
Very, very. Where do people go wrong? I mean, we've talked about a lot of ways you could go wrong.
Putting wheels into the device. No, we talked a bit about building to the extremes. That's probably the most common mistake we see. Some devices will shift while they're being moved from your house to your school to the competition. You need to make sure that the device is sturdy enough that that incidental movement is not going to affect how it functions. We've seen balls or spheres that stall out in devices that the students swear up and down, and I believe them, that it never used to stall there before. But it's because of all the motion, slight knocking that can occur, that bent the track a bit and makes it work differently. So I would be cognizant of that. That's honestly one of the biggest issues with building out of paper, is you need to make a concerted effort to make sure the thing is stable enough to be able to withstand that sort of treatment. That's probably the most common things that I would suggest keeping in mind as you're getting started. Don't build to the extremes. Leave yourself some room to play with on either side. Leveling can be good, like having an ability to actually shift how your device is leveled. We've seen before, and some teams use that to great effect.
I'm actually going to put in a real, as having a child who participated in this event many years ago, that was actually huge, right? We put little feet, like, and one of the things in her toolkit was a level, because if you're practicing in your basement, and basements are surprisingly sloped, so the ball's going to roll. These devices are very sensitive, and the ball is going to roll differently in your basement than it may be on the floor or the table that's at the tournament. So I highly recommend putting the little leveling feet that can be screwed, and having a level as part of your thing. But do remember that adds to the height, right? The height is from the table to the highest spot on the coaster. But it's and if you're too close to the edge and you hike one side up way high, you might be out of. So this is why we're always saying, give yourself some tolerance to make these adjustments. But I highly recommend leveling.
Sure. Absolutely. Absolutely.
And again, as I said, as Brandon said, the stable devices, right? You want the more stable the device is, the more repeatable, right? You'll
Yes.
know what you expect.
Yes.
Paper erodes over time, but if you've got more sturdily built devices, they will do the same thing every time, which
Indeed.
is important in this event, in the testing.
Absolutely.
Somebody's asked, have you noticed zigzag tracks to make speed modifications? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely.
All right, so we're coming to the end here. Briefly, what will it look like on tournament day?
Tournament day, you will come before the events actually start in order to impound your device. You need to make sure you are impounding any tools you plan to use with the device. That is one of the most common things competitors forget. They bring them with them, and we have to politely ask them to leave them with their team.
And your design log. Don't forget to impound the design log and practice log too.
Absolutely. All of those things need to be impounded. Basically, the one thing associated with this event that you do not need to impound is the goggles. But goggles are also required. So you need to make sure you bring those with you as well. So there's the impound. Immediately after, probably within the first couple of minutes, we will post up the time for the day. So you can stop by and take a look to see what time you're working with for the event, but you obviously do not have access to your device until the 8 minutes of your competition time. 8 minutes during which you can have up to 2 runs. Time stops whenever we have to measure something. So that 8 minutes is specifically for you being able to modify your device and complete runs.
Okay. All right. This is great. Is it the better of the 2 runs?
Absolutely, yes. We take the better of the 2 runs for your score.
So you can actually have 1 run in one tier and 1 run in another tier. So you would also, in case you accidentally modified it to be outside the allowed dimensions or something for one of the runs.
Right, absolutely.
Right. Okay. I think, let's see if we have any more questions. I think we've covered everything. Does anybody have any questions on anything we haven't covered? Well, we didn't get to see Eddie Van Halen, but we
bring him over. I mean, he loves making an appearance. I can bring him over.
Sure, bring Eddie over. We'll say hi to Eddie. That'll give everybody one chance to see if we have any questions, because a lot of times questions, somebody said this is amazing. Thank you for your time. Okay. Eddie weighs like 200 pounds and he's as tall as a
he just woke up. I'll show you. He's as tall as I am when I'm sitting down. All right. There he is. Come here, buddy.
Oh, there we go. Yeah. Okay. Hello, Eddie. Thank you. We got to see Eddie, and that makes it all the better. So thank you, everybody, for can you use a bridge as construction? I'm not sure that I understand this question. You mean, can you have a bridge?
Yeah, that's something we would need to see.
Yes. You mean you could use balsa
in mind? That's right.
Is that what you're asking? If you can use balsa? I mean, you're going to have examples of prior devices. No, we don't have. It's a new event coming this year, and it's been out for a number of years, so we don't have any prior ones. But I'm sure you can find on YouTube and Google a bunch of prior devices.
Absolutely.
All righty. Brandon, thank you so very much for your time this morning. This was really helpful. People were really excited to hear all about roller coaster, and we look forward to seeing all of you at tournament.